One of the most common comments that I get about solo RPGing and on the videos that I do on it has to do with people who say that they will buy a rule set and create some characters and then just sort of stop and not really know where to go, or find themselves just at loose ends and flipping back through the rulebook or the source material and not really generating a story. I did a video a while ago about easy ways to be your own GM for solo RPGing, and in that video I talked about some general concepts of creating a solo RPG experience, and those involved the types of resources you could use. I call them generative, suggestive, a rubric, and restrictive, and that has to do with ways in which story can be generated and the different types of resources that you might rely on to do so. In this video, though, I want to step even further back and talk about the one thing that I think is the solo GM's best friend, the solo GM's best helper in whatever type of experience you create. You can have any type of rule set that you want. It could be something that is heavily supported and very detailed in a science fiction world, in a fantasy world. It could be something that's like a superhero universe with one or two existing rule sets and nothing else supporting it, or it could be something that focuses on something like magic. It doesn't really matter. What I'd like to suggest here is that to help give the feeling of the experience that you are that I am looking for when I do solo RPGing, that experience of surprise and that experience of the unknown and the satisfaction of creating a world that comes alive in whatever way that is, whether it's macro or micro, and in whatever theme, in whatever time period. To get that, I think what helps me most is to have something in my mind that I think of as an anchor point. What an anchor point is something that will tether you to narrative and tether you to some type of advancement in the story. There are really two different ways to go here. One could be to create an experience that models a gaming experience where you have a structure of something like game turns or time passing or action allowance. That type of structure can be an anchor point, because what it will do is it will allow you to serve the function that a GM would serve, to provide something to go from here to there with. There are, of course, lots of mini anchor points along the way. So here's a random page here from this book, and we have a listing here of an art object table. You have a very specific here, carved harp of exotic wood with ivory inlay, etc. That is a very specific physical object, and if you were going into a room, say, and seeing that there, it would serve as a focal point, because whether or not you decided to encounter it, you would either be actively moving toward it and interacting with it, or moving away from it, and that would be an actual choice that you were making. So that's a type of mini anchor point and an obvious one along the way. But in the bigger picture, as a solo GM, I think it can be extremely helpful to think of having the one way to go being a game structure as an anchor point, so that you are moving through different turns or taking different actions. But you might say to yourself, that's too gamified. That's not the way that I want to go. There's a second way to go, and these two things are not mutually exclusive, by the way. But there's a second way to go, and that is what I would think of more as the narrative way or the story way. And that is where your anchor point becomes not simply, but becomes like the metaphor or the analogy of a tree, that you're branching out into different stories and you're simply telling the story of something that happens. And you could think of this in traditional terms like a book that you're reading that has chapters, or a play or a movie that you're watching that has scenes. But you could, once you impose that structure, and this is a mental imposition, by the way, this is something that you're thinking in your mind as you move through. You may take notes about it, but when you impose that structure on it, what then happens is, for example, again, just opening to a random page here, if this is a page that describes studying for a certain type of magic, if you are working with a rule set and just creating a situation where your story is that you are trying to create spells and you are trying to advance yourself in your magical abilities, you will be having the RPG experience of a story that is generated and that is a scene in the story. Might it connect to other scenes? Yes. Might it not? No, that could just be what it is. And I talked about this in other videos that I did, where just even the experience of reading through a rule set, of thinking about what you might do with something, that is the RPG experience too of the solo player, or can be if you're thinking of it in that way. So there are, I think, these two different approaches, and when it's working, they can be integrated and you can switch between them, that you can be advancing along in a more traditional manner and also connecting it to a larger story or a scene where simply narrative is evolving and nothing is quote-unquote happening. And of course, if you're playing with a group, that is what could or hopefully would happen with an actual GM that wasn't you, that you would be experiencing some type of bigger narrative progression, story, character advancement, as well as individual tasks and things that were happening. But when you're doing this for yourself, you need to be providing that and thinking about the anchor points and which way you're going to go, or the ways in which you're going to integrate them together, I think provides a situation where the feeling of what you're doing is more like the experience of an RPG when you play it in a group, as opposed to muddling along without having the larger concept of what you're doing. Then it can very much feel like you're just paging through a rule book, reading something here, trying to roll some dice and create an experience that you're actually not having.